December 26, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. Lieutenant General Anthony McAuliffe stepped outside his headquarters as word spread that the first tanks of General George S. Patton's 4th Armored Division had finally reached the besieged town. After nearly a week of encirclement, relief had arrived. The men of the 101st Airborne Division had endured freezing temperatures, dwindling ammunition, constant artillery bombardment, and repeated German assaults. Across the Allied world, Bastogne had become a symbol of determined resistance. The siege, many assumed, was finally over. But something unexpected happened. Instead of remaining behind defensive positions to recover, American commanders immediately began preparing offensive operations. Patrols pushed beyond the perimeter. Infantry units attacked nearby villages. Armored forces expanded the narrow relief corridor. Engineers rushed to repair roads while artillery batteries displaced forward to support new advances. To German commanders observing the battlefield, the decision seemed surprising. The Americans had just survived one of the most intense encirclements of the war. Their supplies had only recently begun flowing again. Casualties had been significant. Conventional military logic suggested they would consolidate, reorganize, and wait until their strength had fully recovered. Instead, they attacked. The answer lay far beyond the courage of the soldiers defending Bastogne. It involved logistics, operational doctrine, terrain, communications, and a fundamental principle of American military thinking. The initiative belonged to the side willing to seize it first. For General Patton and the commanders inside Bastogne, relief was never the final objective. It was merely the beginning of the next phase of the battle. To understand why exhausted American troops chose to counterattack instead of simply waiting for rescue, we must first understand a critical fact often overlooked in popular accounts. On December 26, the siege had been broken, but the battle for Bastogne was far from over. When the lead elements of the U.S. 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne on December 26, 1944, newspapers around the world celebrated the event as the end of the siege. In reality, it marked the end of only one chapter. 9 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had launched the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, in a final attempt to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. At the center of the German advance stood Bastogne, a small Belgian town whose importance came not from its size but from its roads. 7 major highways converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of tanks, trucks, artillery, and reinforcements across much of the Ardennes. German commanders understood this immediately. So did the American. As German armored spearheads closed around the town, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, found himself leading a force composed not only of paratroopers but also elements of the 10th Armored Division, artillery battalions, engineers, tank destroyer units, and numerous support personnel. Surrounded from nearly every direction, the defenders endured repeated attacks, freezing weather, and severe shortages of ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing. German envoys famously demanded their surrender on December 22. McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," became one of the most enduring symbols of Allied resistance. But symbolic victories did not solve military problems. When Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division finally fought its way into Bastogne on December 26, it opened only a narrow corridor. German artillery still overlooked key roads. Enemy forces remained positioned around much of the perimeter. Supply convoys moving into the town could still be shelled, and the corridor itself was vulnerable to being cut once again. From an operational standpoint, Bastogne remained in danger. Relief had arrived, security had not, and that distinction explains why American commanders concluded that waiting behind defensive lines was not the safest option. To secure Bastogne permanently, they first had to expand the battlefield beyond the town itself. To many observers, the logical decision after the relief of Bastogne would have been simple: rest, reorganize, wait for additional reinforcements. But for the American commanders studying the tactical map on December 26, those options carried enormous risks. The corridor opened by the 4th Armored Division was dangerously narrow. In several places it measured only a few miles across, passing through villages and roads that remained within range of German artillery. A determined counterattack could sever the route, isolating Bastogne for a second time. General George S. Patton understood the danger immediately. His 3rd Army had fought through snow, ice, and some of the worst road conditions of the war to reach Bastogne. Simply opening a road was not enough. That road had to remain open. Every truck carrying fuel, ammunition, food, winter clothing, and medical supplies depended on its security. Logistics, not heroism, now became the decisive factor. The defenders had consumed enormous quantities of artillery ammunition during the siege. Medical units needed evacuation routes for the wounded. Tanks required fuel and maintenance. Engineers needed equipment to repair damaged roads and bridges. None of this could happen reliably if German forces still dominated the surrounding terrain. The geography around Bastogne made the problem even more urgent. The town sat amid rolling hills, forests, and key road junctions. German units occupying nearby villages or elevated positions could observe and shell American movements. Remaining inside the defensive perimeter would allow the enemy to dictate the pace of operations. American doctrine rejected that idea. Instead, commanders ordered limited counterattacks to seize surrounding villages, push German artillery farther away, and widen the relief corridor. Every mile gained reduced the threat to supply convoys, and made it increasingly difficult for German forces to isolate Bastogne again. The objective was not reckless aggression, it was operational security. Ironically, attacking was often the safest way to defend. That philosophy reflected something much deeper than the immediate situation around Bastogne. It reflected a doctrine that had been shaping American officers long before the Battle of the Bulge, a doctrine that believed the initiative itself could become a weapon. The decision to counterattack from Bastogne was not made in the heat of the moment. It reflected a philosophy that had shaped the U.S. Army throughout the war. American commanders believed that surrendering the initiative, even after a successful defense, allowed the enemy to recover, reorganize, and choose the next battlefield. A force that remained passive might preserve its strength temporarily, but it also gave its opponent time to regain momentum. General George S. Patton embodied this way of thinking. Throughout the European campaign, Patton emphasized speed, pressure, and continuous movement. He frequently argued that an enemy under constant attack had little opportunity to plan or recover. His Third Army had already demonstrated this approach during the rapid advance across France in the summer of 1944, where relentless movement repeatedly disrupted German attempts to establish stable defensive lines. Bastogne presented the same principle under different circumstances. The 101st Airborne Division had successfully defended the town, but the Germans still retained the ability to influence the battle. If American forces simply waited behind their perimeter, German commanders could reposition artillery, reinforce nearby villages, and prepare fresh attacks against the relief corridor. The Americans intended to deny them that opportunity. This approach was supported by U.S. Army doctrine, which encouraged decentralized leadership and aggressive action. Junior officers were expected to exploit opportunities, rather than wait for detailed instructions from higher headquarters. Initiative was viewed as a combat multiplier, especially in fast-moving operations where battlefield conditions changed by the hour. That flexibility became especially valuable during the Battle of the Bulge. While German units struggled with deteriorating communications, fuel shortages, and increasingly rigid command structures, American commanders often adapted quickly to local conditions. Small unit leaders coordinated attacks, secured road junctions, and expanded control over key terrain without waiting for prolonged planning cycles. The result was a gradual shift in momentum. Every successful counterattack around Bastogne forced German units to react instead of act. Villages changed hands. Artillery positions became vulnerable. Supply routes grew more secure. What had begun as a desperate defense slowly evolved into a coordinated offensive. And as that momentum spread beyond Bastogne, it began to undermine the entire German offensive in the Ardennes. By the final days of December 1944, the battle around Bastogne had become much larger than the defense of a single town. It had become a struggle for the momentum of the entire Ardennes offensive. When Hitler launched the operation on December 16, German planners expected rapid advances toward the Meuse River. Before Allied forces could organize an effective response, speed was essential. Every hour of delay reduced the chances of reaching Antwerp and achieving the campaign's ambitious objectives. Bastogne became one of those delays. For nearly a week, the surrounded American defenders forced German formations to divert infantry, armor, artillery, and precious fuel into repeated attacks that failed to capture the road hub. Time that had been intended for exploitation was instead consumed by siege operations. Then came Patton's relief force. Once the 4th Armored Division opened the corridor into Bastogne, the initiative began to shift. Instead of merely sustaining the defenders, Patton reinforced them. Fresh troops, tanks, artillery ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies flowed into the town, transforming Bastogne from an isolated pocket into a growing offensive base. American counterattacks soon pushed outward in multiple directions. Villages such as Lutrebois, Assenois, and nearby crossroads became the focus of local offensives designed to expand the corridor and force German units away from the town. Engineers repaired roads while artillery batteries moved forward to support advancing infantry. And the once surrounded defenders were now steadily enlarging their operational space. This created a serious dilemma for German commanders. Every battalion committed against Bastogne was a battalion unavailable for the drive toward the Meuse. Fuel shortages were worsening. Allied air power returned as the weather cleared. Reinforcements became increasingly difficult to move under constant aerial attack. The German offensive began to lose its momentum. The Americans understood that simply surviving the siege was not enough. Their objective was to ensure that the Germans could never regain the initiative around Bastogne. By forcing the enemy onto the defensive, they contributed to the collapse of Hitler's final major offensive in the West. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of the battle was how German commanders interpreted this sudden American aggression, and why many of them had never expected it. From the German perspective, the battle for Bastogne should have followed a familiar pattern. A surrounded force would hold out as long as possible. Once relief arrived, it would pause to recover. Casualties would be replaced, supply stocks rebuilt, and defensive positions strengthened before any major offensive operations resumed. That expectation was rooted in experience. Throughout the war, encircled formations often emerged exhausted, ammunition was depleted, equipment required repairs, command structures needed to be reorganized. The logical assumption was that such units would need time before they could fight aggressively again. Bastogne defied that assumption. Even before all of the wounded had been evacuated and supply shortages completely resolved, American units were already expanding their perimeter. Fresh supplies moving through the newly opened corridor were not simply sustaining the defense, they were enabling offensive action. To German commanders, the speed of the transition was unexpected. Part of the explanation lay in American logistics. The relief corridor quickly became a lifeline carrying ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, engineering equipment, and replacement personnel. The U.S. Army's transportation network worked continuously to restore the combat effectiveness of the forces inside Bastogne. Trucks that arrived with supplies often departed carrying wounded soldiers, keeping the system operating efficiently in both directions. Another factor was command flexibility. General Patton's headquarters, the 4th Armored Division, the 101st Airborne Division, and supporting units coordinated their efforts toward a single operational objective: regain the initiative before the Germans could reorganize. Orders emphasized momentum rather than prolonged consolidation. For German officers already struggling with fuel shortages, damaged communications, and mounting Allied air superiority, this aggressive posture created new problems. Instead of containing a weakened garrison, they suddenly faced an expanding American bridgehead that grew stronger with every passing day. The defenders they had expected to remain behind their foxholes were now attacking. That transformation captured one of the defining strengths of the U.S. Army in late 1944. Its ability to combine leadership, logistics, and doctrine allowed it to turn a successful defense into a renewed offensive almost immediately. The story of Bastogne is often remembered as one of endurance. A surrounded garrison held its ground against overwhelming odds, refused to surrender, and survived until relief arrived. But that is only part of the story. The true significance of Bastogne lies in what happened after the relief column broke through. Rather than treating the opening of the corridor as the end of the battle, American commanders recognized that it was merely a change in momentum. A narrow supply route was not enough. The surrounding terrain still had to be secured, German artillery had to be pushed back, and the initiative had to be taken away from the enemy. That required action, not patience. The counterattacks around Bastogne demonstrated the strengths that had come to define the U.S. Army by late 1944. Flexible leadership, efficient logistics, aggressive doctrine, and the ability to coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and supply units into a single operational system. German commanders had expected exhausted defenders. Instead, they encountered a force that grew stronger almost immediately after relief arrived. In the end, Bastogne was not saved simply because Patton's tanks reached the town. It was saved because the Americans refused to remain on the defensive once the opportunity to seize the initiative appeared. The siege may have made Bastogne famous, but it was the decision to counterattack that helped transform a desperate defense into one of the decisive turning points of the Battle of the Bulge, and demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side that regains the initiative often determines how the battle ends.